The silence where a life used to be is the loudest sound in the world. For Jacob Blackwood, that silence screamed across the sun-scorched plains of the Arizona Territory. It was the ghost of his wife's laughter, the echo of her song stolen by a bullet meant for no one and everyone. He was a man hollowed out by grief, an Apache soul navigating a white man's world that had taken everything from him. But what happens when a man with nothing left to lose sees a woman about to suffer the same fate? He wasn't looking for love, only a reason to draw his next breath. He found it in the terror-filled eyes of a stranger, a bride no one claimed, and in one desperate, impossible choice made before the sun bled out behind the mesas. The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated sorrow and sin alike. It clung to the sweat on Jacob Blackwood's brow as he led his piebald mare, Ghost, toward the livery. He moved with a quiet economy of motion that belied the storm raging within him. It had been a year to the day since he'd buried Lena under the lone cottonwood by the creek, a year of waking to the phantom scent of sage and wood smoke on her hair, a year of conversations with a ghost. His heritage was a whisper in his features, the high-set cheekbones, the obsidian black of his eyes, the straight, proud line of his back. But he wore the clothes of the world he was forced to inhabit, worn denim-scuffed leather boots and a hat that shadowed a pain too deep for the harsh daylight. He was a tracker the best in the territory, a man who could read the land like a book. But he couldn't read the heart of the cruelty that had taken his wife, a stray shot from a posse of land speculators clearing the territory. He'd found their trail, of course. He always found the trail. But the tracks had led to a man too powerful to touch a man who owned this town body and soul, Bartholomew Thorne. As he neared the center of town, a commotion outside the Grand Hotel pulled him from his reverie. A crowd had gathered their faces, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. On the hotel's wide veranda stood Thorne himself, immaculate in a tailored suit, his silver hair gleaming. He was a predator in fine wool, his voice a smooth venom that carried across the dusty street. This woman, Thorne declared, gesturing with a dismissive flick of his wrist, arrived here under false pretenses. She presented herself as a suitable bride, a woman of character and virtue. Below him on the top step stood a young woman. She was pinned by the stares of the townsfolk, her body rigid with a humiliation so profound it was almost a physical force. She wore a simple traveling dress, now rumpled and coated with the ubiquitous dust. Her hair, the color of spun corn silk, had come loose from its pins, framing a face pale with shock. Her name, Jacob would learn, was Abigail Finch, but I have discovered Thorne continued savoring his power, that she is a liar and a deceiver. Her family is destitute, her past is a fabrication, and she is utterly without worth. I brought her here, and I cast her out. Let it be known Bartholomew Thorne will not be swindled. She is no one's bride. She is nothing. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Abigail flinched as if struck. Her suitcase, a cheap cardboard thing, sat at her feet, its lock broken. Thorne's man, a brutish oaf named Gus, had thrown it from the balcony moments before. Her meager belongings were scattered in the dirt. She said nothing. Her defiance was in her stillness, in the way she held her chin high, even as tears traced clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She would not give them the satisfaction of a collapse. Thorne turned his back on her and swept back into the hotel, the doors swinging shut behind him. The show was over. The crowd began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves. No one approached the woman on the steps. She was an outcast, tainted by the public condemnation of the most powerful man for 100 miles. To help her would be to defy him. Jacob stood by his horse, his hand resting on the warm leather of the saddle. He saw not just a stranger, but a reflection of his own loss. Lena had been cast out by this new world too, her life erased. This woman, Abigail Finch, was being subjected to a living death, her reputation and future murdered in broad daylight. He watched as the last of the townsfolk scurried away, leaving Abigail utterly alone, a statue of despair in the oppressive afternoon heat. The hotel owner came out and shooed her from the steps. "Go on, get. We don't want your kind here." She stumbled down into the street, gathering the few pathetic items that had spilled from her case, a worn book, a small sewing kit, a daguerreotype of an elderly couple. Her hands trembled, but her movements were deliberate. She would not be broken, not yet. Something in Jacob shifted. The cold, dead weight of his grief for the first time in a year was joined by a flicker of white, hot rage. It wasn't pity he felt. It was a deep, guttural recognition of injustice. Thorn had taken his past. He would be damned if he let the man destroy another's future. He watched her walk aimless toward the edge of town, her shoulders finally starting to slump under the weight of her desolation. She had nowhere to go. In this territory, a woman alone without money or a man's protection was prey. Nightfall would bring predators far worse than Thorn's cutting words. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson. The deadline was a primal instinct, a law of the land he knew better than any other, before nightfall. Safety had to be found before the shadows grew teeth. He tied Ghost's reins to a hitching post, his decision made. It was not a decision born of logic or hope. It was a desperate act, a gamble by a man who had already lost everything that mattered. He started after her, his long strides eating up the dusty ground between them. He didn't have a plan, only a single, insane and unavoidable idea. Abigail Finch felt the world shrink to the space she occupied, a bubble of shame and fear. The sounds of the town, the saloon's tinny piano, the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of children seemed to come from a great distance. She was adrift. Her intended Bartholomew Thorn had seemed so charming in his letters. He'd written of a new life, of prosperity, of companionship. He'd paid her passage from a dreary, impoverished life in Missouri, with promises that had turned to ash in her mouth. The truth was, she had discovered his deception first. On her first evening in his opulent hotel suite, while he entertained business associates, she had overheard him and his crony, a sharp-faced man named Clint, discussing a scheme to defraud homesteaders, using forged documents to seize their land that bordered a creek rich with gold deposits. Thorn had caught the flicker of understanding in her eyes. His courtship had been a sham to procure a docile, pretty ornament. A woman with a conscience, one who had looked at him with dawning horror, was a liability. His public humiliation of her was not just cruelty. It was a calculated move to utterly discredit her before she could speak a word of what she'd learned. Now she walked toward the vast, indifferent expanse of the desert. She had a few dollars in her reticule, not enough for a stagecoach ticket to anywhere meaningful, certainly not enough to survive for long. Each step felt heavier than the last. "Ma'am." The voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It came from behind her, startling her so badly she let out a small cry and spun around her hand, flying to her chest. It was the man she had noticed watching from the livery. The Indian man. He was tall, built of lean, hard muscle, and he stood with a stillness that was both unsettling and commanding. His dark eyes were fixed on her, their expression unreadable. Fear, cold and immediate, coiled in her stomach. She had heard stories. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. She clutched her satchel to her chest like a shield. "You have nowhere to go," Jacob stated. It wasn't a question. "Thorn has marked you. No one in this town will give you a room or a meal. Come nightfall, men like Gus will come looking for you." The bluntness of his words stole her breath. He was right, and the casual way he spoke of the coming danger made it all the more terrifying. I will manage," she stammered, though they both knew it was a lie. He took a step closer, and she flinched back. He stopped immediately, holding his hands up, slightly, palms open. It was not a gesture of surrender, but one of patience. "I am not your enemy. My name is Jacob Blackwood." He looked from her face to the setting sun, a fiery orb sinking behind the distant mesas. "There isn't much time," he said, his gaze returning to hers. "I'm going to make you a proposition. It will sound strange, it may sound insane, but it's the only one you're likely to get today." Abigail weighted her heart, hammering against her ribs. What could this man possibly want from her? "Marry me," he said. The words hung in the dusty air between them. Abigail stared, convinced she had misheard him, or that this was some cruel, new kind of joke. Laughter, sharp and hysterical, bubbled up in her throat, but she choked it down. "Marry you," she whispered. You're mad." "Am I?" He countered, his voice even. "A married woman has protection. She has a name. She has a home. Mrs. Blackwood can't be run out of town. She can't be accosted in the street. She has a husband to answer to." He let the words sink in. "I have a homestead a few miles from here. It's small, but it's safe. It's on my own land. Thorn can't touch it." Abigail's mind reeled. The proposition was ludicrous, a fantasy born of desperation. But as she looked into his steady, serious eyes, she saw no hint of mockery. He was deadly serious. Why, she finally asked the question, a raw plea. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Jacob's face hardened, the mask of indifference, cracking for a fraction of a second, revealing a chasm of old pain. "Bartholomew Thorn took something from me. A long time ago. He and his kind, they feed on the weak. I will not stand by and watch him devour another life." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "I can offer you safety, a roof over your head, food in your belly. My name, in return for what she asked, her fear warring with a desperate, burgeoning flicker of hope. In return, Jacob said, his gaze unflinching, "You give me a reason to keep this homestead, a reason to stay. The silence out there is loud. A man can get lost in it." He looked away then toward the horizon, and for a moment she saw the profound, crushing loneliness he carried. He was as desperate as she was, but for different reasons. This was not a proposal of love or affection. It was a contract, a bargain struck between two shipwrecked souls in the middle of a hostile desert. He was offering her survival. She, it seemed, was offering him a bulwark against his own ghosts. What kind of marriage would this be? She asked the practical question, sounding absurd in the face of their circumstances. A partnership, he answered immediately. You would have your own space. I would ask nothing of you that you are not willing to give. I will protect you from Thorn and any other man who tries to harm you. That is my vow. All I ask is your presence, that you share my name and my roof." She looked back at Redemption Gulch, at the darkening windows and the saloon doors swinging open to spill harsh light and rough laughter into the street. She thought of the long, cold night ahead, of Gus's leering face, of Thorn's smug victory. Then she looked at the stoic man before her. He was a stranger, an Apache, a man the townsfolk would fear and despise. But in his eyes she saw not the predatory gleam she'd seen in Thorn's, but a shared understanding of loss. He was offering a shield, a strange, dangerous, and unbelievable shield. "We'd have to do it now," he said, his voice urgent, pulling her from her thoughts. "Before the sun sets completely. The preacher, Reverend Michael, is a decent man. He'll do it if I pay him." Her decision felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark, hoping for solid ground below. She took a deep breath, the dusty air searing her lungs. She had two choices, a certain and terrible fate alone in the dark, or an uncertain future with this ghost-haunted stranger. "All right," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Yes, I accept your proposition, Mr. Blackwood." A flicker of something relief perhaps crossed his face before it was gone. He gave a curt nod. "Then we best not keep the Reverend waiting, Miss Finch." He turned and began walking back toward the town's small, weather-beaten church, not waiting to see if she would follow. After a moment's hesitation, Abigail Finch, the bride no one claimed, picked up her broken suitcase and hurried to catch up with her future husband. The interior of the Redemption Gulch Chapel was cool and smelled of dry wood and old paper. Dust motes danced in the single beam of amber light slanting through the western window, a stark reminder that the sun and their time was running out. Reverend Michael was a thin, balding man with kind eyes that were currently wide with disbelief. "A wedding," he stammered, looking from Jacob's stoic face to Abigail's pale, determined one. "Now, Jacob's son, this is highly irregular. The circumstances are irregular," Reverend Jacob said, his voice low and firm. He placed $3 silver on the preacher's cluttered lectern. It was a significant sum. "We need to be married. Before nightfall." The Reverend looked at Abigail, his gaze softening with pity. News traveled fast in a town this size. He had undoubtedly heard of her public shaming. He understood the unspoken urgency. He saw the predator circling and the desperate alliance being forged against it. "Lord, forgive me for the haste," he murmured more to himself than to them. He opened a heavy leather-bound Bible. "But I believe he understands the need to shelter his lambs." There were no flowers, no guests, no music. The only witnesses were the silent carved pews and the fading light. Abigail stood beside Jacob, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. This was not the wedding she had ever imagined, a sterile, hurried ceremony, born of fear and necessity. She was keenly aware of Jacob's presence beside her, a solid, warm anchor in the swirling chaos of her life. He stood perfectly still, his attention fixed on the Reverend, yet she felt his awareness of her, a silent promise of the protection he had offered. "Do you, Jacob Blackwood, take this woman, Abigail Finch, to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The Reverend began, his voice gaining a solemn rhythm. Jacob turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was a question in them, a final chance to back out. Abigail gave the faintest of nods. "I do," Jacob said, his voice clear and strong, echoing slightly in the empty church. "And do you, Abigail Finch, take this man, Jacob Blackwood, to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Abigail's throat was dry. She was binding herself to a complete stranger, a man from a different world. But she was also binding herself to the only person who had offered her a hand when the rest of the world had offered only scorn. "I do," she replied, her voice a reedy whisper that she prayed was loud enough. "Then by the power vested in me by God and the Arizona Territory, I now pronounce—" The chapel doors burst open, crashing against the interior walls. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the blood-red sunset, stood Bartholomew Thorne and his two henchmen, Gus and Clint. Thorne's face was a mask of theatrical disbelief and amusement. Reverend Thorne boomed, striding into the church as if he owned it, which in a way he did. "What is the meaning of this? Surely you are not presiding over this. Farce. Reverend Michael paled. Mr. Thorne, this is a house of God. You will show respect. Respect, Thorne laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. I am trying to save you, Reverend, from officiating a union between my discarded baggage and a half-wild savage. It is a mockery of a holy sacrament. Gus and Clint fanned out their hands, hovering near the pistols at their hips. The threat was palpable. Jacob didn't move, didn't even turn his head. He kept his eyes on the Reverend. "Finish it!" he commanded, his voice a low growl. "I pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend finished in a rush, his voice trembling. "You may. Well, the Lord bless this union." Thorne clapped his hands slowly, the sound unnaturally loud in the hallowed space. Bravo. A touching ceremony, the blushing bride claimed at last by the town's pet Indian. How utterly poetic. He took a step toward Abigail, his eyes glittering with malice. "Did you really think this would save you, my dear, hiding behind him?" Before Thorne could take another step, Jacob moved. It wasn't fast, but it was with such silent, fluid lethality that it seemed to bend time. He was suddenly between Thorne and Abigail, a living shield. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was more dangerous than any gun. It was a look of absolute certainty of a man who had crossed a line and would not be coming back. "She is Mrs. Blackwood now," Jacob said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a granite slab. "She is on my land under my name. You will not address her again. You will not look at her again. If you or your dogs come near my home, I will not take it as a threat. I will take it as a promise, and I will answer it." Thorne, for all his bluster, was a coward at his core. He recognized the look of a man who was not bluffing. He saw a frontier justice in Jacob's eyes that his money and influence couldn't protect him from. He faltered, his sneer tightening. "This is not over, Thorne," hissed his bravado returning. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Blackwood." "You were my enemy long before the sun rose this morning," Jacob replied, the words laced with a history Thorne couldn't possibly comprehend. Thorne stared for a moment longer, then spun on his heel. "Come, boys, let's leave the happy couple to their honeymoon." He strode out, his henchmen following, leaving a wake of menace behind them. The silence they left was heavier than before. Abigail was shaking the adrenaline of the confrontation, leaving her weak. The final rays of sunlight had vanished from the window. Night had fallen. Jacob turned to her. His expression was grim. "It's done. We should go." He led her out the side door of the chapel into the new, uncertain darkness. He was her husband. This terrifying, solemn stranger was her husband. As he helped her onto the back of his mare, his hand briefly on her waist, the contact was a jolt of reality. Their bargain was sealed. Their war had just begun. The ride to Jacob's homestead was a journey into a different world. They left the faint lights and discordant sounds of Redemption Gulch behind, plunging into a landscape of profound silence and silver moonlight. The air grew cooler, scented with sagebrush and the dry, earthy smell of the desert night. Abigail held on to Jacob's waist, her initial fear of the stranger replaced by a grudging sense of security. His back was a solid wall against the vast, intimidating darkness. After nearly an hour, they arrived. The homestead was nestled in a small canyon, protected on three sides by rising rock formations. It wasn't much a small, sturdy cabin, built of rough-hewn logs, a corral with 2 horses, and a small fenced-in garden. But it was clean, orderly, and exuded a sense of quiet permanence. It felt safe. Jacob dismounted and helped her down, his touch impersonal and brief. "Welcome to your home, Mrs. Blackwood." The title sounded foreign on his tongue, a role he was still learning. Inside a single lantern cast a warm glow over a simple Spartan room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. A heavy curtain partitioned off a sleeping area. The entire space was meticulously clean, yet it felt empty. It was the home of a man who was not living, but merely existing. "It's not much," he said, breaking the silence. "It's more than I had an hour ago," she replied softly, her honesty surprising them both. He nodded, accepting her words. He gestured to the curtained-off area. "That will be your room. I'll sleep out here by the fire." Abigail was taken aback by the consideration. "Mr. Blackwood, Jacob," he corrected her. "And it's the arrangement I offered. A partnership." He moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, stoking the embers in the fireplace and putting a coffee pot on to boil. Abigail watched him, her mind racing. This man had saved her, married her, and offered her his protection and his home, all while asking for nothing. She had to know why. "Jacob," she began, her voice gaining strength. "You said Thorn took something from you. You said he was your enemy before today." Jacob's movements stilled. He stared into the nascent flames, his back to her. The silence stretched, and Abigail worried she had overstepped, that she had broken the fragile truce between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollowed out, scraped raw with a grief that time had not healed. "My wife, Lena. She was born here on this land. Her people have been here for generations. When the treaties were signed and the reservations were drawn, this small canyon was overlooked. It was ours. We built this cabin together." He turned, and in the flickering firelight she saw the full depth of his pain. A year ago, Thorn's surveyors came. They said his deed, filed in some far-off office, included this canyon. They tried to drive us out. I was away trading pelts. When I came back, he swallowed hard, his throat working. She was dead. They called it an accident, a stray shot from a posse chasing rustlers. But I found the tracks. The men were Thorns, Gus and Clint. They murdered her to get this land. Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The pieces clicked into place. His quiet rage, his immediate hatred of Thorn, his desperate act of marrying her. It wasn't just about abstract justice. It was a deeply personal war. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "The law in Redemption Gulch is whatever Thorn says it is." Jacob continued, his voice flat and hard. "Sheriff Brody is on his payroll. There was no justice to be had. So I've been watching, waiting, learning his business, his weaknesses." He looked directly at her then, and a new startling truth dawned on her. "Your situation today. It was not a random opportunity for me. What do you mean I have been tracking Thorn for a year? I know who he meets where he goes. But I could never get close enough to find proof of his crimes, something that even his money couldn't bury. When you arrived, I watched. When he cast you out, I saw my chance." Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. "A chance for what he made you a victim," Jacob said, his voice intense. "He also made you invisible. No one would believe the word of a shamed woman, a woman married to an Apache. You could go places I can't, hear things I can't. But that wasn't the main reason." He took a step closer. "My fight with Thorn was a ghost story. A man mourning his dead wife. It was easy for people to dismiss. By marrying you, by making his newest victim my wife, I made my fight real. I brought it out of the shadows and into the light of day. I tied my past grievance to his present cruelty. I forced a connection he cannot ignore." Abigail sank into one of the chairs, her mind reeling. She hadn't been rescued out of simple pity. She had been recruited. She was a piece on a chessboard, a strategic move in a long and deadly game. She should have been angry, should have felt used. But strangely she wasn't. To be used implied she had value, a purpose. After the utter worthlessness Thorn had tried to brand her with being a weapon, felt infinitely better than being a victim. "What was it you learned, Abigail?" Jacob asked, his voice low. "What did you see or hear that made him so desperate to destroy you?" Taking a deep breath, she told him everything. She told him about the conversation she'd overheard about the forged documents and the plan to steal the homesteader's land along Sutter's Creek. They mentioned a ledger. She finished her voice, barely a whisper. Clint said Thorn kept a ledger with all the real names and payoffs in the safe in his hotel office. Jacob's eyes lit up with a cold, hard fire. It was the first time she had seen anything resembling hope in his face. "A ledger," he repeated softly. "Proof." Their marriage of convenience had just become something far more dangerous. It was an alliance, forged not just for survival, but for retribution. In the quiet of the small cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of Jacob's past and the dangers of their future, Abigail Blackwood understood that her new life had truly begun, and it might very well be the death of them both. The first days of their marriage were a quiet, watchful dance. Abigail, accustomed to a life of thankless domestic labor, fell into a routine. She kept the small cabin tidy-mended, Jacob's worn clothes with the skill her mother had taught her, and learned to cook with the provisions he had: cornmeal, dried beans, jerky, and the few hardy vegetables he grew in his garden. She discovered he was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of a deep respect. He never entered her curtained-off space, always ensured she had the first and best portion of their meals, and treated her not as a servant, but as the partner he had promised. Jacob spent his days tending to his horses, reinforcing the corral, and disappearing for hours at a time, scouting the land around them. Abigail knew he was watching for Thorn's men, a silent guardian, on the perimeter of their isolated world. At night he would sit by the fire, sharpening his knife or oiling his rifle, the firelight playing over the hard planes of his face. In these quiet moments, Abigail would study him, this man who was her husband. She saw the sorrow that was etched into the lines around his eyes, but she also saw a fierce, unyielding strength that gave her a courage she never knew she possessed. One afternoon, a week after their wedding, the serpent made its move. Abigail was outside hanging laundry on a line stretched between two junipers when she heard the sound of approaching horses. It wasn't Jacob's quiet, familiar rhythm. This was heavier, clumsier. Her heart leaped into her throat. She turned to see Gus and Clint riding into the canyon, their smirks visible even from a distance. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from the cabin, their presence a violation of the canyon's peace. "Well, well," Gus called out, his voice a gravelly sneer. "Look what we have here. The happy little homemaker. Is your savage husband around, Mrs. Blackwood?" He spat the name like a curse. Abigail's hands tightened on the damp shirt she was holding. Her first instinct was to run inside, to bolt the door. But then she thought of Jacob, of the quiet dignity with which he faced the world. She would not show these men fear. She lifted her chin. "He is my husband," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And you are trespassing on our land." Clint, the smarter of the two, chuckled. "Oh, we're not here to cause trouble. Mr. Thorn was just concerned. Wants to make sure you're settling in all right. Wants you to know his offer still stands." "Offer?" Abigail asked, confused. "Sure," Clint said, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "He's a forgiving man. He'd be willing to—" Annul this ridiculous marriage. Give you a ticket on the next stagecoach out of the territory. All you have to do is sign a little paper saying you were mistaken, that you never heard him say anything untoward. Just a little misunderstanding. It was a trap. They wanted to legally discredit her, to get her signature on a document that would paint her as a liar and then get rid of her for good. "I'm not signing anything," she said firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere." Gus's smirk vanished. "Don't be stupid. You think he can protect you?" He swung down from his horse, his bulk menacing. "He's just one man." Gus started walking toward her, his intentions clear in his cruel eyes. He meant to frighten her, to lay hands on her, to prove that Jacob's protection was meaningless. Abigail's blood ran cold, but she stood her ground, her laundry basket clutched in front of her. "I'd stop right there if I were you." The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was Jacob. He was perched silently on a rock ledge 50 feet up the canyon wall, his rifle resting easily in his arms, the muzzle pointed directly at Gus's chest. He had been there the whole time, a ghost in the rocks watching. Gus froze his eyes wide as he looked up. Clint cursed under his breath, his hand inching toward his pistol. "I wouldn't." Jacob's voice echoed again, cold and deadly calm. "My first shot will take your friend through the heart. My second will break your drawing hand, Clint. I am a patient man, but I am not a forgiving one. You are on my land. You are threatening my wife. This is the only warning you will receive." The tension in the canyon was thick enough to taste. Gus slowly raised his hands. Clint, after a long, hateful glare at the figure on the rocks, followed suit. They were outmaneuvered, caught completely by surprise. Jacob's knowledge of this land was so absolute that he had become a part of it. "Now," Jacob said, his voice dropping an octave, "get back on your horses and ride out of my canyon. Tell Thorne the next time he sends a message, he should send an undertaker with it." Without another word, Gus scrambled back onto his horse. Clint wheeled his mount around his face, a mask of fury and humiliation. They galloped away their retreat, as hasty and clumsy as their arrival had been arrogant. Abigail didn't realize she had been holding her breath until it came out in a ragged gasp. Her knees felt weak. A moment later, Jacob was beside her. He had seemingly materialized from the rocks, his movements as silent as a shadow. He looked her over his dark eyes, searching for any sign of harm. "Are you all right?" She could only nod her throat, too tight for words. He looked at the basket in her hands, then at her pale face and the defiant set of her jaw. A flicker of something new entered his eyes, not just respect for a partner, but admiration. "You were brave," he said simply. The quiet praise meant more to her than any flowery compliment ever could have. In that moment, standing together in the aftermath of the threat, their bargain felt less like a contract and more like a true alliance. She had held the line, and he had been her salvation. "They will be back, won't they?" she asked, her voice returning. "Yes," Jacob said, his gaze fixed on the canyon entrance where the riders had disappeared. "But next time they won't come just to talk. We can't wait for them to make the next move. We have to get that ledger." The serpent had shown its fangs. Now it was time for them to strike at its heart. The failed intimidation attempt hardened Thorne's resolve. The patrols around Redemption Gulch doubled, and Clint's watchful, suspicious eyes seemed to be everywhere. A direct assault on the hotel to get the ledger was suicide. Jacob and Abigail spent the next few days in tense deliberation, knowing their window of opportunity was closing. Thorne was a man who didn't tolerate loose ends. He would escalate his efforts to eliminate them. The idea came to Abigail in the middle of the night. It was audacious, dangerous, and hinged on the one thing Thorn couldn't control: the town's simmering resentment. "We can't fight him on his terms," she said to Jacob over their morning coffee. "He expects you to come at him with a gun." "He doesn't expect me to come at him with a whisper." Jacob listened intently as she laid out her plan. It was a woman's strategy, relying on nuance and psychology rather than brute force. He saw the brilliance in it and the immense risk. "It's too dangerous for you," he said immediately. "It's more dangerous to do nothing," she countered, her gaze steady. "You said it yourself, Jacob. He made me invisible. It's time to use that." Reluctantly, he agreed. The next day, Abigail rode into Redemption Gulch alone. She looked nothing like the defiant woman who had faced down Gus and Clint. She had deliberately made herself appear small, frightened, and beaten. Her dress was plain, her hair pulled back severely, her shoulders slumped. She was the picture of a brow-beaten wife trapped in a miserable marriage she had chosen out of desperation. She didn't go to the saloon or the general store. She went to the one place where women gathered and gossip was the primary currency, the seamstress's shop. As she purchased a spool of thread, she spoke in a hushed, trembling voice to the seamstress Martha, a known town crier. "I've made a terrible mistake," Abigail whispered, loud enough for others to overhear her eyes darting around fearfully. "My husband, he's not a bad man, but he's obsessed. He talks of nothing but vengeance against Mr. Thorn. He believes Mr. Thorn was responsible for his first wife's death. He spends his nights cleaning his rifle, talking to himself. I'm so afraid of what he'll do." The story was a masterpiece of misdirection. It painted Jacob as a tragic, unstable figure, consumed by a grief-driven fantasy. It made him the threat, not Thorn, and it subtly planted the seed of the very truth they wanted to expose: Thorn's connection to Lena's death, but wrapped it in the guise of a madman's delusion. The whisper campaign spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. By afternoon, the whole town was talking about the poor, terrified Mrs. Blackwood and her dangerous, half-mad husband. Clint heard the rumors and reported back to Thorn, who was delighted. The narrative suited him perfectly. It would be all too easy to justify Jacob's death as self-defense against a deranged widower. The second part of the plan was Jacob's. He needed a diversion, something big enough to pull Thorn and his men out of the hotel. He rode to the north to the small cluster of homesteads along Sutter's Creek, the very land Thorn was trying to steal. He found the homesteaders, men and women, with dirt under their nails and fear in their eyes. They had all received official-looking eviction notices, backed by Sheriff Brody's reluctant authority. Jacob didn't try to rally them to a fight. He spoke to them as a man of the land. "Thorn wants your water, your soil," he said, his voice calm and reasonable. "The papers he has are lies. But my word against his is nothing. We need proof. The proof is in his hotel safe. I have a plan to get it. But I need a distraction. I need you to give my wife a reason to be in town, and a reason for Thorn to be looking the other way." That evening, as planned, a delegation of homesteaders, emboldened by Jacob's words, rode into town. They didn't come with guns drawn. They marched directly to the sheriff's office, demanding he investigate the legitimacy of Thorn's land claims. It was a peaceful but very public protest. The commotion drew Thorn out of the hotel, just as Jacob predicted. He couldn't afford to look like he was hiding. He, along with Gus and Clint, went to the sheriff's office to reason with the homesteaders, his arrogance on full display as he belittled their claims. This was Abigail's cue. Dressed as a hotel maid in a spare uniform, she had managed to purchase a bonnet covering her corn silk hair. She slipped through the hotel's kitchen entrance. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Every shadow seemed to hold an enemy. She moved swiftly through the service corridors and up the back stairs to the second floor where Thorn's office was located. The door was locked. She pulled a thin piece of metal from her pocket, a corset stay she had filed down. Her father, a locksmith before he'd lost himself to drink, had taught her a few things. Her hands trembled as she worked the lock, the sound of the tumblers clicking, seeming to echo through the silent hallway. Finally, with a soft snick, the door opened. The office was lavish, filled with leather and dark wood, and there against the far wall was the safe. It was a large, imposing iron box. This was the one part of the plan that was pure chance. She had prayed it would be unlocked. Thorn was arrogant, and with the town so firmly in his grip, he might have become careless. She turned the handle. It didn't move. Locked. Despair washed over her. It was over. All this risk for nothing. She leaned her forehead against the cold iron, fighting back tears of frustration. As she did, her eyes fell upon a portrait of Thorn hanging on the wall. It was slightly askew. A flicker of intuition, a desperate hope made her reach up and straighten it. Behind the frame, scratched into the plaster of the wall, was a series of numbers. With trembling fingers, she spun the dial on the safe, entering the combination. The heavy door swung open. Inside were stacks of money deeds and a single black leather-bound book. The ledger. She grabbed it, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She didn't have time to look inside. She tucked it under her maid's apron and slipped back out of the office, closing the door behind her. Her escape was just as heart-pounding. As she neared the back stairs, she heard footsteps. It was Sheriff Brody. He was walking up the main staircase, his face a mask of conflict. He had left the confrontation at his office, unable to stomach Thorn's lies any longer. He saw her. His eyes widened in recognition, then flickered down to the bulge under her apron. For a long, silent moment, they stood frozen. He was the law. She had just committed a crime. He could arrest her, return the ledger to Thorn, and condemn them all. "Ma'am," he said, his voice heavy. "Sheriff," she breathed, clutching the hidden book. He looked at her, then toward the sound of Thorn's arrogant voice, drifting up from the street. He had been Thorn's man for years, trading his integrity for a steady wage. But seeing this woman's terrified, determined face, and knowing what was at stake for the homesteaders, good people like, he used to be something inside him finally broke. "The back staircase is clear," he said, gruffly, not quite meeting her eyes. "But Gus is watching the alley. You'll have to use the front exit. Try to blend in with the staff." It was not an absolution, but it was a chance. A lawman, in a quiet act of rebellion, had chosen a side. Abigail nodded her thanks, her heart swelling with a desperate hope. She scurried down the main staircase and walked head down right through the hotel lobby and out the front doors, the ledger a burning promise against her skin. The whispers of redemption had finally found a voice. Abigail met Jacob at the edge of town, as planned, the heavy ledger passing from her hands to his. The moon was high and bright, illuminating the hope and terror on her face. There was no time for celebration. They rode hard back to the homestead, the fate of Redemption Gulch tucked inside Jacob's saddlebag. Inside the cabin, by the light of a single lantern, they opened the book. It was worse than they had imagined. Page after page detailed Thorn's crimes in his own meticulous script, payoffs to officials' names of the homesteaders he was targeting, fraudulent assays of worthless land he sold to naive investors. And there, on a page dated a year ago, was the entry that made Jacob's blood run cold. Payment to G. Miller and C. Rowe, $50 each for removal of squatters in the Blackwood Canyon. One complication: female, handled. Land is now clear. Gus Miller, Clint Rowe. It wasn't a stray shot. It wasn't an accident. It was a $50 murder. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of Jacob's breathing. He closed his eyes, his hand resting on the page, a final, terrible communion with the truth of Lena's death. When he opened them again, the grief was still there, but it was now forged into a single cold point of purpose. "Dawn," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "We end this at dawn." They didn't wait for Thorn to come to them. They brought the reckoning to him. As the first pale fingers of light touched the eastern sky, they rode back into Redemption Gulch. But they were not alone. Behind them, on horseback and on foot, were the homesteaders from Sutter's Creek, their faces grim and determined. They were no longer a disorganized group of victims. They were a posse of the righteous. They stopped in the center of the main street, right in front of the Grand Hotel. Jacob dismounted, holding the ledger. Abigail stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm, a silent pillar of support. The commotion drew people from their homes. Windows opened, doors creaked. Sheriff Brody emerged from his office, his face pale but resolved. He walked not to Jacob, but to stand a few paces away, a man caught between two worlds, about to make his final choice. Thorn appeared on the hotel balcony, a cup of coffee in his hand, his expression one of annoyance. When he saw the crowd, the homesteaders, Jacob holding the ledger, and the sheriff's telling position, his face curdled with rage. "What is the meaning of this?" Brody Thorn roared. "Arrest this man. He leads a mob. They're not a mob." "Bartholomew Sheriff," Brody said, his voice loud and clear, carrying across the silent street. "They're witnesses." Jacob held up the ledger. "This book tells a story, Thorn. It tells of stolen land and broken lives. It tells of bribery and fraud." He flipped to the page, his voice rising to a raw cry of anguish. "And it tells of the murder of my wife, Lena Blackwood, for the price of $50. A gasp went through the crowd. The whispers Abigail had planted had now exploded into a terrible truth. Thorn's face went white. He was exposed, his crimes laid bare for the entire town to see. "Lies," he screamed. "The ravings of a savage Gus Clint deal with this." Gus and Clint emerged from the hotel saloon, guns drawn. But the homesteaders were ready. A dozen rifles were leveled from the crowd. Gus and Clint froze, caught in a sea of angry, determined faces. "It's over." Thorn Jacob called out, his voice ringing with authority. "There's no more hiding." Thorn, in a paroxysm of fury and desperation, pulled a small derringer from his coat pocket and fired wildly from the balcony. The crowd scattered, screaming. But the shot wasn't aimed at Jacob. It was aimed at Abigail. Jacob moved faster than thought. He shoved Abigail behind him, the bullet tearing through the flesh of his left shoulder. He grunted in pain but didn't fall. He drew his own pistol, a single fluid motion. His shot was not wild. It was aimed precise and fueled by a year of silent rage. It caught Thorn in the chest, throwing him back against the hotel railing. He hung there for a moment, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before tumbling over and crashing into the street below. At the same instant, Gus and Clint made their move, firing into the chaos, but they had underestimated their opponents. Sheriff Brody, his conscience finally clear, drew his pistol and shot Gus squarely. One of the homesteaders, a man whose land Thorn had tried to steal, fired his rifle and Clint went down. Silence fell thick with gun smoke and disbelief. It was over. In the days that followed, Redemption Gulch was transformed. With the ledger as evidence and the sheriff's testimony, Thorn's entire criminal enterprise was dismantled. The homesteader's land was secured. The town, free from the tyrant's grip, began to breathe again. Jacob's wound was tended to by Abigail in the quiet of their cabin. As she cleaned and dressed the injury, their hands touched. And for the first time, it was not the contact of partners or allies, but something more. The grief in his eyes had not vanished, but it was no longer a ghost that haunted him. It was a memory he could carry, not a weight that would drown him. One evening as they sat by the fire, Jacob turned to her. This marriage, he said, his voice quiet. It was a bargain, a means to an end. You are free now, Abigail. Thorn is gone. You can go anywhere you want. I can give you the money for a stagecoach ticket. Abigail looked around the small cabin at the sturdy walls that had sheltered her at the fireplace that had warmed her. She looked at the stoic, honorable man who had married a stranger to protect her, a man who had faced down his demons and won. She had come to this place with nothing, a bride no one claimed. But here in this unlikely home, with this unlikely man, she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. All my life, she said softly, meeting his gaze, I've been trying to get somewhere else. Away from poverty, away from loneliness. For the first time, I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. She reached out and placed her hand on his. If you'll have me, Jacob, not as part of a bargain, but as your wife. A slow smile touched Jacob Blackwood's lips, a genuine smile that reached his dark eyes and lit them from within. It was the first true dawn on the Blackwood homestead. Their story had begun in desperation and violence, a marriage made before nightfall, but here in the quiet aftermath, forged in fire and loyalty, their love was just beginning to see the light of day. A story of vengeance can become a story of justice. A marriage of convenience can become a bond of love. The story of Jacob and Abigail proves that even in the harshest landscapes, scarred by loss and betrayal, the human spirit can find a way not just to survive, but to flourish. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not when we are searching for them, but when we are simply trying to offer a stranger a shield against the storm. Their journey was one of fire, but it forged a love as strong as the mountains and as true as the sunrise. If this story of love and vengeance in the untamed West resonated with you, if you believe in second chances and the power of unexpected alliances, then please help us share it. Hit that like button to let us know. Share this video with someone who loves a tale of true grit, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories from the forgotten corners of history. Thank you for listening.